This is going to be another episode of ReScope, the show which the theme of the title is that we sort of recontextualize certain either topics currently in the mix or things historically, or we try and be able to reach around in CS history and reference different things with me and Paladin here. So what we do, if you don't know the format, is we each come with 3 topics and I layer them alternately just so we keep it interesting as the back and forth. And it is very much in the vein of how I do essentially my talk shows anyway, but more if I know that I'm going to be giving a lot of opinions, which is, if you know my style, the joke is I actually ruined my ability to speak in some, I didn't really, I can definitely do if I want to, but doing those Thorin and Thoughts videos did sort of ruin me, because it just made it so that I do just go point, stack a point, that's like a chapter 1, point, chapter 2, stack, and then the thing with the other people is, unless they keep the notes or they know how to do, they're just at the end going shit, I don't know how to start on that. So you have to learn on this show, that's the whole point. You have to sort of keep up, you have to be able to do it yourself, so it's all good. We'll see how it does again on this episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with your first point. And your first point, what you told me roughly, was you wanted to talk about what the impact of home crowds is. So set this up for me. What's the angle on this?
Yeah, I kept it very vague because I think there's a number of ways we can go about it. But with the Rio Major coming around, I'm seeing this narrative that's been bubbling up of there's this Brazil crowd advantage now. You got to look at all these Brazilian teams and you got to see, maybe they can go even deeper than they usually do because they're playing in Brazil. And that got me thinking. I was like, okay, well, we've got a couple of events already taken care in Brazil at this point. We've got Belo Horizonte, EPL Season 4 finals, Blast Sao Paulo, DH Open Rio. I have all of these listed out here. And in all of those events, I have seen Brazil actually underperform and actually just absolutely capitulate. When they are favorites, when they are even in situations where they look better than they should be, they just absolutely capitulate in the home crowd. I'll give you the example of Belo Horizonte SK losing to a stand-in nothing Mouse Sports. That was an absolutely abysmal one. EPL Season 4, they were absolute favorites against C9. They lose there in Sao Paulo. And the Blast Sao Paulo, MIBR was grouped. I mean, obviously, that one's a bit to, I don't know, because at that point, MIBR wasn't really that great. But then DH Open Rio, Furia was the favorite in that. I know it's a smaller event, but still, I still want to drive that point home. That Avangard, the team that they lost to in the final, was, I believe, the post Krakow win, or it was either that or the pre-Krakow win. So basically, the
Starladder, you mean?
Yes, sorry, Starladder. I'm thinking of Gambit, but Starladder, and so they were absolutely out of it. They didn't have any capabilities there, and that was when Fury was on the up and up. So I think I really want to just contextualize for everybody, what do we actually consider to be the impact of home crowds, in particular in this angle of Brazil. We can obviously pick examples from other regions, but I think I want to stick with just this Brazil to start things off.
Okay, yeah, I'll jump into it. So I think this is actually a topic I think I've developed a lot on talk shows over the years, precisely because I always thought it was just a very lazily handled topic. If you don't know historically, it just goes like this. Coming from certain key, it's mainly American sports at lowest, where there's not really a concept like a neutral crowd, except for the Super Bowl. In the NBA, for example, you're always playing home and away. That's the only 2 possible scenarios. And the premise in those sports goes and does tend to hold up. Unless you're some exceptional team in history, you tend to win more at home, and added to that along similar lines, the better the team is, the more they win at home, and therefore it's really hard to win on the road, for example, in the NBA playoffs or in the NFL, etc. Actually having home field advantage is an enormous factor. So people, what they do is they take that concept, and like a lot of things in esports, they do a 1-for-1 into esports, particularly CSGO, a game where we have all these massive arena crowds and stadium events. So there's always a scenario actually in esports where, as long as there is a home team, they can actually have the home advantage in that scenario against maybe 15 different teams or 10 different teams. And so you would think, even though people take it as right, it's a massive advantage, it's always an advantage, and as you say, you start theory crafting but if a Brazilian team's in Brazil and then the crowd is notoriously really passionate and hype in Brazil, that's going to make them better, so they'll probably perform. That's taken, but as you say, no one ever runs the numbers, because I also noticed that trend years ago. I was they're worse at home, if anything. It actually seems to be wrecking them. If anything, they're legends in Europe and stuff, and faraway continents where they've been able to play essentially on the road against maybe the home team themselves. So one of the things I think is quite weird is people do just assume in esports that's the case, even though I haven't really seen what the track record for that would would be. And also, the other thing for me is this. When people take that premise, because a lot of it does come from players, right? First of all, players do just pander to fans in every regard anyway. So they do just tell every great crowd, like, it's you guys that made the game amazing. And, and then obviously the famous thing is whenever they like win the game or whatever, they go, oh, you guys made it possible for us to win. Like, some of that's true, as in, like, you want to have fans, they might have an expectation of succeeding in front of them. Obviously, it's a special crowd. Maybe it means something to you. But some of that is just fuckery. It is just nonsense of, like, it's what players say to sound cool and be popular. So I think basically that combined with the fact that when you are playing in a big match with a home crowd and you're doing well, it makes it the ultimate emotional feeling, because what's happening is you're already doing the awesome move in the game, then the crowd's cheering for you, and you're going, oh, I'm getting really confident, I'm going to do another play, and you do another play and it's working. Like, everyone will know the classic example is probably that Astralis against Heroic Blast 4 finals, right? Heroic was the better team, but you saw the way the game went. That would be what everyone thinks of, I think, when they see the home crowd element, and they think it's pretty good correlation, like it holds up. But I have to say, like, I also think the Brazilian example is a very good case of this. I think that's an example of confirmation bias, selective memory, whichever you want to pick. Because what no one tells you about, and I do think is what's happened, especially the one where they lost to Cloud9, that ESL Pro League, where they just were supposed to win that easily. Yeah. That's an example to me of where the very fact that it's your home crowd, the very fact you are supposed to win, the very fact that you're losing and it's going badly in the game and the underdogs beat, I think that's when the home crowd element can play against you. Because one thing that's actually quite famous in American sports, even where it is this strong correlation, is if you are some like legendary clutch player who just doesn't give a fuck what people cheer for or against, they always say the most satisfying thing is, like, in the psychological war, to try and make that crowd silent. Well, in the same sense, right, that it's going to be satisfying for you, I think that kills teams when you're supposed to be the favourite and all those people who have, they're all there just to watch you. They're basically waiting it's almost like that joke of, like, they're just waiting with, like, the fucking party poppers in the bottle to, like, pop the champagne. And then, by the way, if you lose, it's like, oh, put the champagne back in the fridge. Like, you've ruined it for everyone. You're the arsehole then. So I actually think that angle is the part that pros never think about, because you remember, pros are always thinking of the best case scenario, and I'm obviously going to win this game, it's going to go great. They're picking out what correctly are moments when it's felt like it was a strong association, that's what helped me was the crowd. But I think they ignore that, like, the crowd can definitely crush you as well if you're the bigger team. And I'll even say that I actually think that is this is where my take's a bit controversial. I actually think the crowd hurting you is the biggest factor, not it helping you. Because I actually think in that scenario, there's two ways it goes. Either the fact that the crowd's cheering for you psychs the other team out. Like, if you were Heroic in that building, Astralis might have been confident people cheering, but if anything, you're just sort of going, like, what the fuck? Like, we're Danish as well, like, and we're the better team, and what? And they're just only going to cheer for those guys. That'll tilt you, dude. I've seen this happen in tennis. I'm a massive Federer fan, people might know. And if you don't know, one of the areas that you realised in tennis where bias exists is every single arena Federer's probably ever played in, he was always the crowd favourite. And probably the maddest example was when Djokovic became the best player. Even if Djokovic was number one and won everything, the crowd was sort of like, yeah, fuck you though, Djokovic. I hope the other guy wins. And you could tell, right? On the one hand, like, Federer was loving it, but that's actually one of the things a lot of people give Djokovic credit for. You almost had to, like, battle the crowd as well. Right. A lot of people can't do that. I think it actually crushes the opponent. So I actually think it's the destructive power of the crowd sometimes that's the more relevant one. Does it kill the enemy, or does it actually get turned back on you? Because there was a great anecdote I'll tell you very briefly, which was when the Boston Celtics won their last championship in the 1980s, in 1986 against the Houston Rockets. When people look back now, they'll go, well, obviously, they should have won against that team. It was a team that didn't win the championship. But what they don't know is going into game 6, I think it was game 5, they had like a really bad game or something. And there's a story that they tell, I think it was Bill Walton told it, where basically Larry Bird told the Boston Celtics before they went in, like, yeah, look, I know this is like game 6 or whatever. I think it was maybe like in front of the Boston Garden. He was like, I know this is like game 6 and indeed we could go to game 7. But he said, like, you can hear that crowd out there, and there was all this crowd sort of, you're like in the back by the bleachers, and you can just hear all the crowd. And he said, listen, they're cheering. They want someone's blood, and it can either be the Houston Rockets or it can be ours. I think that's the dynamic that people sort of don't even think about in this factor. So there you go. There's my spiel. What do you think?
I completely agree. I think that the destructive nature of crowds has been one that's gotten into the Brazilians' head more often than not. Obviously, NIP as well. I think they also struggled in Sweden a bit. That was also very odd. I mean, I think they probably had even more pressure, considering in some of those scenarios they felt like massive favorites. Sure. They just couldn't convert. I mean, you think about those major finals that they all dropped the ball in. And then I think the other angle that I wanted to take in particular was the international aspect of it. Like, if you're an international roster like a FaZe or a G2, you're like basically lauded everywhere. Like for some reason that I've noticed that everywhere they've played, they feel like crowd favorites. And I'm not really sure what the angle is on it. Is it an organizational thing? Is it a player thing? I mean, usually these international rosters have these like star-studded players like your Nikos, your Kerrigans, and your Ropses and whatnot. But I'm very interested to see what your take on how you perceive international rosters. Is that just a general plus to just being international, because they can't really hate you because you're not necessarily regionally against any of these spaces, but at the same time you don't have like a home crowd per se?
I mean, I will say that does seem to be the outlier, because you'd think it should be the opposite. They should be the team that never has a home crowd and is always being hated on, you'd think, because they're all the different nationalities. But like, first of all, I guess on one level, by the way, it can also work as a hack. Like, I'll give you an example. Famously, when they do that V4 tournament, that's only supposed to be teams with a player from like what, Slovakia, Czech Republic, these four. Famously, the reason why FaZe got to go 1 year is because they had CadiaN, and obviously he's from Slovakia, right? So in theory, there are the cases that if you have the one player, that's going to help in itself, right? So you have got 5 chances now, if you have 5 different nationalities, to have someone care about your player. And then also, I'll say as well, yeah, I think having a star player helps. If you've got like a superstar player, that's someone that fans probably like anyway. But I also think a massive aspect is, like, for me, any Kerrigan team, just having Kerrigan seems to make the crowd on your side, because he's just one of the best showmen, isn't he? And he's just sort of somehow cultivated that aura rather, where even though like there are definitely nutters on the internet who hate him for some reason, he actually seems with fans almost universally loved. Like, the joke is, he's one of the only ones I've ever seen who's lost to the Brazilians in big matches, like quite a lot of times. But then even the Brazilian fans seem to love him, and their logic is almost like, look, obviously if he plays Brazil, fuck him. But if he's playing anyone else, actually he's our second favourite. It's almost that, you know. So actually, I wonder if that is even a factor. Now, I get the feeling a lot of these teams, because they're not a one that, like, you know, Australis, you just support them if you're Danish. I get the sense, right, that what people do is a bit like what people sometimes do in sports, where you have your main team, you're a Real Madrid fan or a fucking Lakers fan, but if that team goes out, you have your second team to follow. You're not just going to quit the sport. I get the feeling teams like FaZe, Clan, are the ones with the big superstars and these big characters. I think that's everyone's second team, or it's the team that people default to if their squad goes out. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good angle. I mean, the way I perceived it is just that, like, they're so like neutral, and like they always have that like organizational hype around them, that everybody is just like naturally like, okay, well, I think I have to support them in this scenario because I'd like to support CS as a whole. And when I think about CS, I think about G2 and I think about FaZe and these massive organizations with backing behind them. So I kind of see it that way, where yeah, you've got these national teams, but like at the end of the day, spectators that come from like different esports and different, like, yeah, just esports in general, where you see like these big league teams and you're like, oh, I think of G2 and I think of League, or obviously in the West, and then in like Call of Duty, obviously FaZe being a big one, and then you're like, okay, well, if I pop into CS here and I'm out for a weekend, or I'm out like watching online or whatnot, I just support those big organizations. I think that's how I saw it, rather than like the nationality thing, the international aspect of it. I was more so like, these organizations are just so big that these spectators just naturally like gravitate towards them.
Okay. Right, let's do this then. So my question, I've just done mine as like a very topical one, because I actually think now is probably the most interesting time ever to ask this question. It's not like the old one where people just throw out the first 3 big names that you all know, and then it's like, who's even going to be it? Basically, the question is, who are the 5 best in-game leaders in the game right now? And we're not talking when we say best like greater. We just mean if today you had to take, like if we were drafted IGLs for tomorrow's tournament, who are the 5 that we're taking? So go on, give me some names. Who are you thinking of? I think it's tricky right now. A lot of the old names aren't maybe as good, right?
This one was really fun for me because I mean, obviously it's still difficult to get those 3, 4, and 5s, I think, or actually more so 4 and 5. But you've got so many options, and I think number 1 has to go to Kerrigan. I think that's a no-brainer. Best mid-round caller in the game, and he's clearly done it in such a way that he can get any roster that he really wants to the top once he's gotten the pieces, even if he doesn't have the pieces, frankly. But I think number 2 is going to be a little controversial for me. I think I want to go with Apex, just because I think making this international roster work as well as it did. I know it's still early doors, them winning EPL, but I think the fashion in which they did it, I did a video on it, and I tried to watch as many demos as possible. And this guy has like figured out how to mid-round with an international squad that I just wasn't expecting him to do at all, because I think he really struggled with getting everybody on the same page when they first started this Danish roster, and they've slowly started to kind of integrate things, and maybe it's Spinks helping, and maybe it's Zonic as well, but I feel like now he's clicked, and this is kind of like that extra page that he needs in his like kind of his IGL story. Like, okay, I've brought up kind of these French rosters who are, I mean, to most people, they didn't feel like the true like unlocked version of Vitality before they actually went to these events. So bringing those teams to finals and bringing those teams to break streaks of Na'Vi when they were really strong, I thought that was always very impressive. And then finally with this international escapade, I think that him unlocking them, I think if they just do well in Rio, I think it's a no-brainer for me to put them on number 2. And then the reason why I put number 3 as Electronic is because I think that a lot of the things that he does is because of Blade. And so I think I tried to take it at face value and said 5 best IGLs. And for that reason, I think there's a lot more help from Blade in comparison to how much more help there is from Zonic to Apex. So I think that while Electronic has learned to actually call, I think in EPL, I know Maui Snake was talking about it as well, but there were some incredible mid-round calls from this guy. I say mid-round calls so much because I think that is really the mark of a true great IGL, because if you can actually develop your strategies on the fly and read the opponents like a book, I think that is what makes you a true champion, not just knowing when to execute. I mean, I think that's a part of it, but I think that's a very small slice of it. Not knowing when to execute and just knowing when to just let your stars out on the fly. I think those mid-round calls are super important. So I think Electronic is learning that kind of skill, but I think that there's still a lot of things pre-planned by Blade that Electronic brings to the table. And while that system is really good, I still think there's more that needs to be done from Electronic. And then I'll keep going. I'll give number 4 as Nafany. Nafany, I think, has a very unique perspective of the game where I think he's one of the IGLs behind Kerrigan that's brought the super, like, okay, I'm going to be this incredibly aggressive IGL, obviously art as well, but an incredibly aggressive IGL that takes all the space and sets up my passive stars, like your Shiros, like your Hobbits. And then we're going to also have another aggressive rifle on the other side of the map with Axile, and kind of just let open these maps with this super aim heavy, the super aim heavy style, which I don't think necessarily works in this day and age like well, at least in the lower tier teams. You need setup and you need space created. And I think Nafany has always done it so well for the C9 squad. And there's still so much potential for them. I think the only thing that's holding them back right now is themselves. It's more of a mental thing more than anything. But the fact of the matter is, when that system works, they look absolutely unstoppable. I mean, we saw it in the online era. And when they find a way to actually harness that online energy when they go onto LAN, you obviously saw it at Dallas, and then you saw it in bits and pieces at EPL, especially in the quarterfinal, quarterfinal. And I think that's where Nafany kind of shot up the ranks for me, because it made me realize that all of these times where he's played Kerrigan and he's lost these series, all these mental games, I felt like Nafany finally had some one-ups. Obviously, he had the individual show up with Axile and Shiro and Hobbit all pulling their weight, and obviously even Inters. But I think Nafany pulled his team through the line there and made them beat a phase that I think is basically like a metaphor for like beating their inner demons. And I think that development has kind of made me shoot him up to number 4. I know there's some controversy with whether or not he should continue to lead the squad. And then finally, I think number 5 is probably my most nuanced conversation. Is I was kind of tossing it up between Hooksy and Jame, and I think my 5th pick is going to be Jame. I'm just going to make that call right now, because I think that with the roster that he has, I think, which is entirely much worse than what he had before with Yekindar and Buster. I think with Norbert and Fame, he's found a way to make them actually look competitive again. And I think that is a testament to his system. I think that he's found a way to completely shift the dynamic of this team. I mean, it used to be a very like, okay, Yekindar is going to take this space and we're going to go off the back of it and whatnot. And we're going to have Sanji as a super supportive player. And now you've got Norbert and Fame, and you've kind of remolded your team to be a much more team-oriented play, where you've got Flit as a star, but I don't even think he's necessarily like the star. He's just put into certain positions that, I mean, I think that he can flourish in, but they've always had backing behind him to make sure that he prospers. And I think that as a whole, making Flit the star of the team, which I don't necessarily think he is a star player outright, is I think a real testament. And you can see the development in how Jame approaches the game individually as well, where now he's more aggressive with the AWP and he's willing to take a little bit more duels here or there. Obviously, the jury's still out on whether or not he can lead them to a title per se. But I think it's just more convincing to me right now than the whole Huxley angle on G2. But I'm very curious to see whether or not you actually put him on your list at all.
I did actually, in the end, have 3 of the same 5 as you. But the order and some of the other names probably will shock people, because actually the whole reason I asked this question, like I set up initially, is I actually don't think there's like a really wrong set of names here, because one of the things about this year is the LAN circuit is way smaller. So actually the sheer results of the LANs are probably going to skew who people have where. So for example, I didn't have Electronic on my list. I didn't put him on there. Like, he didn't IGL for that long. Yeah, they wouldn't blast, but like that was also a period where they're all fragging out their minds. They've obviously looked a bit whack since when the team's fallen off, and quite frankly I just want to see more out of him. I want to see what he's doing, because the problem as well I have with him is he's also fragging really well for an IGL, and as much as that might sound like, well, how can that count against him, it's like, unfortunately that also does make it easier potentially for you to IGL if you can frag. It's one of the reasons, for example, I also left one I was really considering like touch and go to put as my 5th was maybe Tabson, but I actually think that's a reason I wouldn't take him. I do think he can be a really good IGL, but I also do think because he has just a way better skill level than a lot of the other IGLs, I think it maybe makes his job a little bit easier, and it's tougher for me to always know, like put it this way, when people are like the Kerrigan player where you just know they're not going to frag out, then I can really see what he's doing and what he's trying to develop in the round. If you can also run in and shoot the 2 people in the head, now it's a bit more difficult. Like, was that actually a call? Did you make a push and think you were going to die, and then I never saw what the real tactic was like and you just busted the round up? It makes it way trickier. So my 5 are like this. I've got number 1 Kerrigan for obvious reasons. I mean, just look at all the success this year. Then you look at things like, we all know he's not that good individually, but he still sort of like hides himself well or uses himself in areas where it makes sense to sort of be traded on, etc. I would also say just always look at the map pool. The map pool is basically never bad for FaZe. They even have that scenario which all the great teams do, which is maps 4 and 5. You absolutely can win against anyone basically but the absolute best teams on those maps. So you can steal a series. You can come back when you lose your map pick. These are really key angles. And then crucially for me, I actually think this might be the best IGL in year of his entire career, because he does seem like he's found that extra gear in the clutch games. And you think there's been a billion games that have gone 13-13, and that was the games where maybe he would have lost sometimes, maybe even a normal IGL and normal team loses. But his team seems to almost never lose those games. That's so rare that they lose, that as my joke on Twitter goes, they've gotten to the point now where people have to nitpick their wins. That's how many times they win and how rarely they lose series. And then also, of course, they just won so many of the big games, so many tournaments. So I think this might be the most, this is his masterpiece this year, in my opinion. So Kerrigan, number 1. Number 2, I actually went, this might be a little bit of a shock with people. There's a little theme to a couple of these ones. I went with CadiaN. Can you believe it? I actually did say CadiaN, because here's the problem. I do think it's just his AWPing that costs him individually and costs the team. Now, look, you could shade a little bit of what I said about Electronic and about Tabson into that, which is he is also to some degree, because he's the AWPer, setting the game up around his AWPing. And you will notice when he goes off, those are the absolute best games for Heroic. Those are the ones where they win and everyone gets super hyped. But the problem is, because his AWPing just can't consistently be as good as the great AWPers, that's also why Heroic can be a very streaky team. But I think when you look at the squad outside of that, for me, even when the stats said Stown was like, I don't know, the 5th best rated player in the whole world on LAN, I don't think the eye test ever really showed like, oh my God, like, it's not like, you know, like those famous, the reverse POV movies that they make of like Nico. So if you made that a Stown, it wouldn't look that nuts. Like, it would look good. He's killing people and he's outplaying us and he's positioned well and he held that spot well. It wouldn't be like the Nico one where the joke is you're holding the angle. Then like, you just like an elbow moves in and shoots you and like, I didn't see the guard, like I didn't see the barrel. Like, I don't feel like it's like that. So even then, I don't think, kind of like the Kerrigan angle, I don't think his number 1 player's some beast superstar who's just doing it himself. There's no meme for CadiaN or Kerrigan like, twists, go kill, like fucking Stown, kill when they come in the bomb set. That's not a meme, because, for good reason. They're actually, I think, sort of like overperforming to some degree with the talent that they have. And so I think CadiaN's calls are pretty good all in all. Another team, by the way, you notice throughout all these iterations, they always have 4 or 5 maps too. They always match up against almost everyone well. They can certainly lose, and they certainly do disappoint many, many times if you get into their style. But I do think, like, actually, he's one of the better parts of it. I think, aside from his open, I think he does a really good job. So, bit of a shocker there, CadiaN number 2. Yeah. Then we'll go, I actually did also take Apex. Now, I will say I could easily have hopped off that train the first half of this year because it looked dreadful. And he had all these pieces where, look, it's not that they're like fragging was the issue for me with Magisk and Dupree. Obviously, neither of them had good stats. But like, as you've seen with the lineup when they've gotten better now, like, they're not like the team play goes away. It's like their understanding of the game goes away. So I was a bit underwhelmed that he couldn't use them more. True, as you say, he's coming from the French scene and calling with a different style of people. And also, by the way, he worked under Extaz at that time. He's had to change his coach over to a coach that, if you see, I would say has a very different coaching style, it seems, to than how Apex calls. Even though I can't know if that was Extaz's style, there's probably a compromise, I imagine. But it does seem like the Zonic style, as you see, that they are the team like Astralis on CT that just save all the time, every single time. It's like maybe the correct play. They're kind of the bit conservative team. So I think it has been a tussle and a back and forth between him over IGL and style. But once they've gotten Spinks into the lineup and they've gotten some more firepower and Ziwu's back to his top level, so he's got some pieces. Still doesn't have the craziest roster, but has a pretty good roster and some very good pieces. I think now you see, just like at the end of last year when it was just Ziwu and then a bunch of decent or okay players, does seem like he can call a very good game. Maybe he is a bit more streaky, but I agree. Like, I also think like he's gotten his style. He understands basically his sort of what rhythm of the game is. And I actually think in that team, this is why I said if they were kept failing, the other move was obviously put Magus IGL, because that just seems to be how Apex wants to play. So if you're going to go away from that and you really want to do Astralis T-side, you probably do need to swap the IGL. So if they're going to do with this style, as far as I've seen, it can work, and it does work, and it's worked in 2 different lineups now. So yeah, I give him a lot of props. I know he's not a traditional IGL, so a lot of people probably in their brain maybe even discount him for this particular conversation, but I think he's earned it. I think he's earned his status. And then the other name I had the same as you, I got it at number 4, is Jame. I actually think that Yekindar leaving was the best possible thing for Jame, even though it was the worst possible thing for Virtus Pro / Outsiders. Because it's a look, I'm going to do some content on this soon, but I'm actually pretty pissed off with this whole fucking Yekindar hype train. Because the angle that people are taking isn't like, what a skilled player. Of course he is, one of the fucking revelations of the last few years. It isn't, wow, he's leveled up on LAN really quickly. He's only been playing tier 1 LANs for what, like a year? Like maybe less or something? Like not that long. Or it could even be the third angle of like, guy comes from, like a Nico style, comes from a small country, don't associate with Counter-Strike, goes international. In this case, he had to go CIS region first. It's not even where he's from, but he's not from like Russia or something. And then after that, he's going to Team Liquid. Like, this is amazing stuff. But the problem is, like every good story, people have to fucking over-egg the pudding and exaggerate the story, and the fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and I was barely carrying it back to the port, and in reality, you caught like a nice fish like that, right? So the problem I have with the Yekindar angle is this, and this does affect Jame. People act like, cause this is where Jame has his own CadiaN problem. As an AWPer, James actually, in my opinion, a better AWPer than CadiaN as an AWPer, but he just has that incredibly selfish style, and people will know because he's the IGL and the AWPer. Well, there's no one to tell him no. He can just save every time he wants, and he can make you save every time he wants. And sometimes it does look like that old joke that I made, which is like James at his best in a late round scenario when he's trapped and he can't escape. Right. Then he just goes fuck it. Usually wins the 1v2. But if there's a back door, then the joke is like in those movies where they're talking to someone, then they turn around. When they turn back, like the door's just swinging like Batman. Like what the fuck? That's like Jim. He's just gone. Like he don't get a final word. Yeah. So the problem I have is this: it's only when you combine the two, I think it becomes like a little bit toxic or a bit of a fucked up environment. As an IGL on his own, I actually think he's really good. I think this team without Yekindar showed it, because that was the problem with that story I was setting up before. Because the Vanguard team was so one-dimensional, and it was actually him fragging out at that start of dimension that made them go to the final. It wasn't even that they were that good a teammate. You can go back and look. They were mad streaky. The maps that they were winning on didn't even make sense somehow. Their map pool was trash, and they weren't that great a team before. And I know they won the Blast Day afterwards, but they weren't that great a team afterwards. They dropped off fairly quickly. That makes people think like, they were just never that good. It's like that lineup wasn't that good. Go look who's there. Almost none of these players. There is no Yekindar. There is no Flip. These are the players that have added the firepower. So I think Yekindar joining just made it look kind of like Team Liquid. Like, oh, it's him. He's bringing the whole style to the team, and he's the good player. And they're all fucking idiots, but he's like... The guy is a fucking entry. He does just run in and shoot people with an AK. Like, people have given way too much. Like, they're talking like he's like some mastermind, like he's Kerrigan or something. So I think that angle actually has sapped away from the idea that James is a good IGL. But you see when Yekindar's gone, mate, this Outsiders team is almost back to a Vanguard state. They're slightly better in terms of fragging because the Fame guy, bizarrely, has turned out to be pretty good. Flick does put up numbers. Jame himself still... So you still sort of got some fragging, but they are nowhere near what they were when they had Yekindar, when they were at their peak and like... whatever, like I guess on the online era, even in late 2021, they could still be good. They're not that team anymore. So in my opinion, you look at this team, what is winning them these games aside from Jame IGLing? Like, you look and say he does a banging job. And that old style, even without your Kindar, still present, which means, by the way, when you don't have the guy run in and get the 2 insane opening AK kills, which he now does in Team Liquid, you still win rounds. And he still can do that style where he runs the fucking clock down and he makes you make a weird decision at the end of the round. And if you do it the wrong way and you rotate the wrong way, he punishes you and you think, fuck, how does he get away with it again? But he gets away with it, and he does it so many times. That EPL performance was a fucking masterpiece, mate. It was amazing. Yeah. Like, how many times does he drag way better teams into the deep waters of like, what the fuck are these rounds? And then that somehow plays to his advantage, because in my opinion, he's one of those players where, I don't really know chess, so my analogy might be shit here, but he's one of those players where he's not trying to like beat you with like the pure anti-strat. He's trying to make the game chaotic. So it's like scenarios none of us have seen, and we're all just having it on the fly, like reacting, and that's where he's at his best. So I think it's a really unusual style, but I think if you look at the pieces he's working with, I think it's incredible what he's doing. Doesn't matter, I think he's a meme as a fucking human, and I think he's absolutely fucking garbage ass teammate, and I would never want to play ever on his team, no matter who I am. But I have to give it up to him in that one area. I think he's nailing it. And then my last name, this is the one that might be a little bit slightly controversial too, because like I say, I haven't put Electronic on there. I haven't even put Nafany on there. You notice I did my 3 out of 5 there, because again, the problem I have with the Nafany one, it's not too dissimilar to Maui Snake. I do think he overstated it massively, and the problem he had was the Boomich angle was like a fucking reach worthy of like Street Fighter 2 Dalsim. Like, that was fucking mental, man. I don't know why it was great point up until that, when he said the Boomich angle, right? If he'd said like Jerry or something, maybe I'd be on board with it. Maybe that could work. But the fact he went Boomich, like, nah, I'm not buying that, man. Like, fuck it. What I would say is this: my problem with the Nafany one is that whenever they win, it does look like Axile frags everyone's face off, and then on the CT side, Shiro hits every AWP shot. So my problem with that one is I haven't sort of seen as many of the times, which I use for the inference to see how good the IGL is, where you sort of steal a win, or you win when you're actually the worst team, or you win when your stars aren't playing. Like, as much as people might not like MSL, I've seen him win tons of fucking games like that. It wasn't like he only did it because config or something went off. He could win messy games too, or games on the map that maybe you're not supposed to. I feel like Nafany still has to prove that to me a little bit on land. So my fifth one actually is I'm going to go with Snappi from Ents. And my reasoning why is, I think when he had Spinks, that was the only like truly world-class player I think he had. Like, I think Dekar looks like he's gradually can get there. Maybe it's going to take him a bit longer, maybe to change his role. I think if you look at the other players, though, he did that with Hades, mate, going to the semi-final of the Major. I'm not hating on Hades, but he seems like he's been a very streaky player, and quite frankly, he's the one that looks like he suffered the most when he got to Tier 1 and he were at the big lands. So I think if you just look at his results with the lineups he's got, who he's having to play and beat, then obviously everyone did that thing where Snacks gets all the credit for that AM Dallas run. Mate, how does the IGL not get credit for losing his best player, taking an old washed-ass player and going to the final of the tournament? Like, what do you want? Andy was beating like FaZe. Like, give me a break. Like, so to me, I know the new lineup hasn't really kicked in gear yet. It's still got a few problems. It's definitely a bit rough around the edges. But here's my prediction. This lineup, because by the way, there is no Spinks player in this lineup. This is one of those lineups where he's working with, like, the joke is, you know how Mouse used to be called Budget FaZe in 2018? Yeah. This is like Budget FaZe now. Like, he doesn't have the superstar players, like, relative to the Simples and the Zewus. But my prediction is, give him a few months, maybe it'll start at this Major, you will start to see those performances again, where this time there isn't a player like Spinks where you're like, right, he's got to go to the next team. Like, Valde and Madden, these guys aren't going to FaZe next, or probably ever. Like, even if Dihar gets really good, he's not going to be on G2 with Nico probably. So I think this is the period where we'll see if I'm right or wrong. This is where Snappi will establish himself as like a great in-game leader, and it'll take him many years, but maybe he's on his own Kerrigan run where this is going to be his best year as well, however many years deep. Because if you notice, that's the cool thing about IGLs, because a lot of it is like experience and understanding and how to control a game. That does seem to just scale as you get older, even if your skills diminish.
Yeah, I think the Snappi angle is one that I've completely overlooked. I think that one makes a lot of sense because he's always the one that's had to make do with lesser parts, and I'm shocked that he's able to do it that consistently. And it feels like he's found a bit of a renaissance on his own right, because I don't think he was a very good IGL previously. Like, he was a very, I mean, kind of whatever. I mean, he has a lot of great pieces to play with, and he kind of didn't really do much with it. I mean, I'm just thinking about the recycling door that he had with Heroic. And it never really amounted to anything. They were kind of always on the cusp of doing something great, but they never could. They had a couple of big upsets, but nothing really other than that. But I think that now I did the reason why I didn't put him on there was just because of the fact that he had to fight with this new lineup now, and I still need him to prove it and then I think that's when I would kind of have a little bit of a shakeup in the top 5. I think the one that I have the most pushback to is CadiaN, because I just don't see the similar type of like macro that I'd like to see in a good IGL. Like he gambles a lot when he plays CT sides. And to me, it's like, I don't know if it's like I'm not analyzing the game hard enough, or if I'm like underthinking it or something. But like sometimes the gambles just look like complete coin flips, where he like I feel like he's got like absolutely
he reaches
no
a lot,
reads.
mate. Absolutely.
Yeah, like he has like absolutely no read on the game. He's not like on an Inferno, for example. They won't even have a player like sitting down half wall looking down banana, and they'll just gamble all 5 or like all 3 or 4 of them onto the A side, and they just win the round, and they look like geniuses. And I think that map in particular, the way he approaches Inferno, their win rate, it feels so inflated, and maybe that's just like a bit of like a spectator angle or something. But to me, that eye test feels a little odd, and I think the way that he approaches the macro game is just not how I see it. But I will give credit to him that he's able to create like a sum of his a better sum. How do you say it? What was it?
Better than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, better than some of their parts. Yeah, that is the phrase I was looking for.
Thing is,
but,
I know what you mean on that angle, but here's how I would tie that in. I've got a narrative for CadiaN that no one else seems to have, because they don't seem to ever tie like psychology and personality into the game. Right? What I've noticed is the real reason I think CadiaN overreacts to every win is because if you know his career, where he was just a journeyman, he wasn't even an IGL, he was just an all-right AWPer, and he constantly was kicked out of teams, and no one fucking cared about this guy. No one wanted him to win. No one wanted to be his teammate. He was just a guy who was just off in the wilderness. He never was supposed to even be in a position to have all these wins and be on a good team and be top of the world and go to semis of majors and quarters. So to me, he is living out his dream, but he's doing it like a modern day like kid would, where they've been overly propagandized by movies. So I've actually noticed this before. It's one of the reasons I once made a comment that like triggered the fuck out of Taz, and he flamed me on his stream and said, I don't know anything about CS or whatever. Because by the way, Taz is a mad two-faced individual. You see, then he just, like when I was at the major last time, he was like, oh, I'd love to see you at the major. Like, suck my dick, motherfucker. Yeah, I'm sure you do. You were crying when I said all the shit about you, because basically I told a story which comes from Taz's teammates that when it was back in 1.6, so there wasn't even the cameras on you the same degree, there wasn't a big stream, he already was doing it, where he also is a guy where, because he like thought movie style of like when you're in the big moment, you're the leader, you give that speech that hits this guy in the chest, it makes this guy fight, and then when you win, that's why you're all crying, it's so emotional. But it's like every semi-final Taz can't be like, you know, do it for the Gipper or whatever, and you know, fucking your dad would have wanted this before he died. It can't all be like that. You do that like one time in the movie, that's like, it's got to be a really poignant moment, and in that scenario you've got to win. Like if you do that and then you lose half of those times. So what I said the story was, some of his teammates derogatorily, obviously behind his back, did nickname him the General, because it was like he kept coming in on all these matches and thinking like, right, I'm going to fucking, you know, make this epic. And famously, if you know, he's won a lot of championships, but he's also been in a billion semis and finals that he's lost. And actually, it didn't, the movie ending didn't happen. Basically, I think CadiaN's a bit like that. He's trying to make like all these moments what you dream of it being if you're a guy who went out on day 1 of the major and you never saw, whatever, day 3, and you never saw what the finals are like. So in my opinion, that's why he calls it that on CT side, because he's always trying to make, that's the thing. I do think there's no way he can be making these reads. I think basically he's just gambling that like, this would be genius if this stack worked though. Because it would. If they like ran into a 3-man stack on like fucking Inferno, you would look like, oh, that was the call. But here's the problem. There's one line I've got for you that's a classic line. It's an old school story, and only Americans will understand this because we don't have this term in England, believe it or not. But basically, when Kobe was really young and he was on the Lakers, like people might not know, even though Shaq now tells a good story, like, yeah, I could always tell he was good and he was like an up-and-coming player, and eventually I was going to like give him the keys to the car and that, like. But if you actually see, the reason they obviously had friction was Kobe really did think as soon as he came in the league, like, I could be the best player. Like, I am the one who's going to take the final shot. Like, you know, I am the fucking better player. Even than Shaquille O'Neal, probably like the best player in the NBA at the time. And so basically, because at the time, they to try and like dampen his ego, they used to actually make fun of him. Like, they used to call him Showboat, and they used to tell him stuff like, oh, you know, you think you're Michael Jordan or whatever. But obviously, because they were trying to like sort of haze him a little bit to be like, you know, calm the fuck down, basically. Like, wait. And so there was a line that Shaq said back when he was pissed off and he just left the Lakers and he still was at war with Kobe, where he said something like, Kobe always wanted to be a hero, but a hero isn't nothing but a sandwich. Now, we don't have that term for like sandwich in the UK, but if you know that reference, it's a great line and it's like a good bit to banter. CadiaN is that guy. He's always trying to be the hero, mate. So for good or for ill, look, when they win, it means he's going to get all the credit. If they ever win a major, it's going to all go to him. But if they lose, Some of that, they do look like ego calls sometimes. I'll give you that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I will say, like, to bring the kind of players that he did, I think before even they actually blew up, when they brought in, I believe it was Refresh and Tessas before that EPL game.
Shush.
Or the EPL tournament.
Refresh and Shush.
Or sorry, yeah, it was Shush, right. I was very confused by the move because I think they had just gotten a good result. And they decided to bring these guys in. Like they had an overperformance of sorts, and then they win that tournament. And I think that after that, I kind of realized like, look, this guy has kind of scouted this out for so long, and he's like picked these players out individually, and it's taken him a while to get there. But I think that he's finally molded this team to be like the. I mean, you say general, and I think it's a very similar term where he is like this very central figure of the team, and he's got like 4 younger players that are so willing to listen to him, and they listen to every one of his calls. That it's like the ideal team that he's been like waiting for like his entire career, maybe. And I think now he's just figured out how to make it work, and I think that should be given credit that he's molded this team after so long, and they're still doing decent, I will say. And I think that compared to some of his previous teams, I think that it's definitely an improvement in that regard. And I think the overall average and skill ceiling of his team now compared to the teams he played previously is definitely much more consistently at a higher level.
Right, we'll move on to another question. So your question then was, how much time do we give a roster before we call for someone's head? So what's the context to this?
Yeah, so there's that guy Nero CS. He does those statistical videos, articles on HLTV where he kind of poses a question that people talk about a lot and tries to throw numbers at it. But I wanted to do it in the context that we would kind of do it, more so in the historical aspect and the more of the eye test aspect and kind of what we see from the players before they actually get onto the server. And I think the kind of nuance that I want to go about it is 2 angles. There's one of like, okay, if you put in a star fragger or like a sort of like a roll for roll upgrade, so i.e. like a rifler or an AWP player, which should be like a direct correlation to their success being immediately like plug and play, so to speak, or an IGL, how do those time lengths differ? And then I think the other angle that we can save for a little bit is building a team from scratch versus a tenured squad, because I think that conversation has also been way overblown where people treat both the team from scratch and the tenured squad that they're kind of just like plugging and playing and moving maybe 2 pieces here or there into completely different, into very similar boats of conversation where they're like, oh yeah, I just give them 6 months, both of them, and they should be good to go. And I think I'm very interested to pick your brains as to both of those concepts. So we'll start with that IGL versus Star Fragger one.
Okay, for that one, I would say I actually, as weird as this sounds, would probably give the Fragger way less time. Like, in my opinion, if you bring in a star, and especially if it's like everyone knows this guy is a star, he knows he's a star, the team recruiting him knows he's a star, and in theory, we've recruited him to be a star. Like, we've recruited this guy to be like when FaZe Clan got like Cold Zero, they weren't bringing him to just be an all right player. Like, fuck that noise. Or when JKS went to Call, they were recruiting these guys for big money to come in and be like, you're going to complete the team, and if we're good, we're going over the top. You're going to win us tournaments, so you're going to be the MVP, right? I think with that sort of a player, because logically, you're going to cater to them. You're going to give them their roles. You're going to give them probably their best CT spot. You're going to give them setup space, maybe. You're going to give them all these things that are the resources of Counter-Strike. I always say the reason why I developed the concept of like the second star and the first star and the balance was from obviously Dota and League with like who you give the farm to and who you play around, etc. In the difference is, instead of it being like the farm and the gold from those games, in CS the resources are things like, do you get set up for you? Do you get space created for you? Do you have people who play off you? Do you have a spot that's the most favorable? Do you have the best fragging position in the game? These are the angles to which I think you judge these players. So if you're giving someone basically everything, and in this analogy, like a striker in football or a scorer in basketball, they're just not producing numbers. Yeah, actually, I'm probably not waiting 9 months, a year for that. I'm going to wait, like I would say, between 3 and 6 months. And if it really isn't working, either we have to be very cynical and I've got to sort of shift you out of some of those resources and spread it somewhere else. Because at the end of the day, just like in football, you've got to score goals. You have to shoot people in Counter-Strike. You can do everything else fancy you want, but even because even the great teams that could do it with almost like Ences of the world, they also don't win many tournaments. That's one of the reasons why you need to shoot people at the end of the day, no matter how good you are. So I think for stars, you probably don't get as long. I think in that case, you're brought here to do a job, which is frag out, and you're not doing it. So we can try a few different spots and a few different things, but eventually I've got to get me another star, or I've got to shift you into another role. It's time for you to go to a different chapter of your career. Whereas if you're the in-game leader, like, it depends stylistically, because there's certain in-game leaders. It's like the thing that people always said when I did my show Stratbook with Legia. Because he's coming from big with God B and then with Tabson, then he was a coach, right? They're coming from the world where they're trying to do like Astralis type Counter-Strike, like build up a whole system and then have like really intricate things. And that's the reason why, if you notice, Big never has a super deep map pool. They have a couple of maps they're amazing on and they have everything on. And then the others, they just try and use teamwork to win on, basically. Maybe they nick a win here and there. But one of the reasons why is because that type of system, it's really hard to do. And the thing that people underestimate, it's why I think it's silly to copy Astralis unless you're the rare team like Big. The Astralis core had played together for like 6 years or something, guys. Like, they weren't just a new team. And the problem, obviously, in this case is, if you're an elite team, you can just keep the same players. People like Big, they also, because of firepower issues, have to keep cycling players in. So it resets you a little bit on that system. It brings you back down again. It's not as simple for that new guy to walk in the door and frag out like he did in his last team. Your team has structure. You have a set star. For that, you probably need to give him a bit longer. Because if you recruit that IGL, you should know what you're walking into there, which is he's coming in to be like total control, run the team, do this approach. And so I'm actually committing to that. Like, I'm building my whole squad through his style. I'm not just going to cut him after 3 months. Like, I'm going to give him... That's why I actually thought the Alexi B cut was pretty wild in G2. I know everyone else is cool with it now. And we all pretend for some reason, like, Huxley's won like a Grand Slam or something. Like, he hasn't won anything, for fuck's sake. He had like one good run to his semis. But for some reason, he's already way better than Alexi B. Weird how that works. Like, that's another one where, in my opinion, like, if you invest in that guy, invest. There's no point going halfway and then going, I think it's not working for either party, is it? Like, you just wasted 3 months and you just wasted 6 months, didn't you? And I also think on that angle as well, they didn't play as many lands as people make out. Like, people, remember, the time spans are different. 6 months back in the day, you could play like 8 lands potentially. Now you play like, what, 3 or 4? Sometimes you don't qualify for one. You go out with one early. So, like, I do think on IGLs, it's different if it was a Kerrigan or one of the more loose IGLs. Maybe that guy I am judging on a short time span. Maybe, again, you're coming in, we're going to do what you want, you're getting the calls off. If we're losing, you're probably not making good calls. So, again, as you say by this setup, it's very different depending on what type of a person we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think the whole reason why I brought up this question, I wanted to push it, is for that Alexi B move, because I thought it was just, it didn't make any sense. I think they were hamstrung to make a move. I felt like they were pressured by a lot of different parties that something had to change, and so they just pulled the trigger on Alexi B, and he got caught in the crossfire. But I think that the way I kind of dictated is via major cycles rather than months, because I feel like usually the roster moves happen at the very end of the major, and so I kind of see like, okay, now is the start of the season. Now's where you can overhaul. And yeah, I think for the star buyout situation, I would be like, okay, well, I think a 1 major cycle should be kind of the absolute limit, which is around 3 to 6 months, pretty much. Because yeah, I completely agree. There's no point. I mean, your whole job is to click heads. If you can't do it, what the hell's the point of you being on the team? I think the one with a little bit more nuance though is the IGL thing, and I think 2 major cycles makes the most sense for something like that. Because yeah, I mean, maybe in the first major cycle, you don't necessarily have the whole system in check by the end of that time period, but by the end of that 1 major, you've basically scouted out what the potential issues are and what you should be able to fix. Is it a personnel thing? Is it a my specific system thing? Or should I be working with the coach on a different type of system? Like, what should I be doing here? And I think that I know it seems like in esport, we have to move super fast, and we have to, after that 1 major cycle, we got to win now. We got to do it. But I think that when you bring in an IGL like an Alexi B, you've got to allow time for him to gestate and figure out, is Jax the right player to have on this team, or should we just put him to the curb and bring somebody else? I think that they didn't actually have a true vision for how they wanted to occupy those roles that were kind of chopping and changing so often, and for that reason, I think that costed them. And I think that with that second major cycle, that's that kind of like, okay, well, now we can give them more heat for everything that happens, because you've had that whole major cycle to kind of gestate and understand the game. Now you've got to put your money where your mouth is and actually perform. I know it sounds like you're pouring in a lot of time and money, but I don't think that you can just jump ship on an IGL's identity that quick. And I think that I'd rather go longer than shorter, because I think that there still could be unlocking that just magically happens. Like you think about the Mouse lineup with Kerrigan. I mean, it wasn't a very good lineup to start out with initially. It took time for them to actually work out through everything. And it was that one, I don't remember what tournament it was exactly, but they interview, I believe Chris Stray or something. He's like, yeah, we completely changed all of our spots. Like nobody plays the position that they originally played, and we're a completely different team now. And everybody's like, what? Like, what is the whole point of this team now? But I mean, you looked at how the results just magically changed. That there was that one little key detail that just put them on top. They were winning LAN after LAN. They were beating Astralis in very tight scenarios. They're absolutely blasting them out of the server. And that's with lesser pieces. And I think at the end of the day, that was even with Kerrigan, a looser IGL. And with an IGL like Alexi B, who needs more time, who needs to understand the kind of how these players tick, like what their kind of tendencies are, and how he wants to actually control and move them around the map, like he did with ENCE. I think you can't do that with the G2 until you actually understand them. And I think that they cut the plug too early there. I think that's kind of obvious. But we'll move on over to the more team aspect of this question, because I've always been mulling about the whole C9 angle of it when they brought in with Henry G, and I always thought they gave him too little time. But what time frame would you give a team from scratch to actually produce results before you actually say either one, we blow up the core, or two, we start to actually chop and change and we still keep giving this core an opportunity?
I think I have a really different take on the Cloud9 Henry G lineups. And so it's actually something I've intended to do a video, but obviously at this point in time, it's not really a pressing matter. Like I'll do it when I get around to it. Basically, it's spoiler, that one could sit on the shelf. It's going to be the same now as it ever will. Like my take basically is this. The reason I was hyped initially is exactly not for the lineup they had. It was for all the names I heard that they were going after and that they were like that close to getting. And then this guy would have joined, but the other guy that he needed to join wouldn't join. So then you have to go right back to the drawing board. What about this guy here? And then things like maybe Zipnix would join, but in the end he wanted slightly too much. So you had to settle for Esotag. And it's like you made so many compromises that at the end, it was like, this isn't really the team I wanted. But like, I mean, I've done all this work and I've had signed the players. Like, I can't just quit before we even start. So I was never that hyped about the original lineup. Like, I think if you go back and look, I even said, like, you know, to be a top 10 team was like the goal or whatever. It wasn't like be your best team in the world. And that was with Woxic, where they were gambling. Woxic gets really good again. And as you can see, not only in the server was he pretty fucking bad and quite frankly played quite stupid and gave orbs away and stuff. But even worse, I've heard behind the scenes. Put it this way, I'll just drop the gem like this. You know that story about why Poison got kicked from Complexity, where he maybe like didn't listen to tactic? Like there was some of that shit going on with Woxic, I've heard, basically. And he was being a bit of an arsehole, and basically he was kicked for good reason. Like he actually didn't deserve to stay on the kind of money he was when he wasn't putting up numbers. He was sounds like being a bit of a dickhead. So my problem is, it was more the idea of like, wait a minute, if you're going to bring in Henry G and you're going to give him carte blanche and he gets to go after all these big free agents and he doesn't get them this time, then it's not like it's Woxic or bust, because it was. After the Woxic move didn't work out, it was like, right, now bring in Zeppa. It's like, Zeppa instead of Woxic. Like, Zeppa's like a canny player, but he's not like Cold Zero or something. Oh, well, this is back when we thought Cold Zero was good. Or fucking Nico or some monster player like that. Like, you've got to have stars. And so for me, none of those C9 lineups, once Woxic failed, ever had the firepower. So I actually thought, like, it wasn't for me that they didn't give, like, the lineups time. Those lineups probably had as long as they should have. They both actually sort of failed on their arse. And even when they were close to win, they never did. They never did get the wins. You have to eventually get some W's. It's no good always being, oh, so close. Like, who gives a fuck at the end of the day? But my problem with that lineup was always just like that you bail on the whole project. Because again, if you're committing to the whole thing, we're going to build from scratch a new international team, then in my opinion, to do it in good faith, you've got to do things like, look, if the first signing doesn't work, look at what G2's been able to do. Vitality. They didn't get their first big lineup and go, didn't work, right, scrap the whole team, get out Magus and Dupree. You know what, Monacy and fucking what would have been Jax was still there. Right, you're out as well. Get the fuck out. Like you're still like, wait, mate. I've still got Nico and Monacy. So let's add another piece in. JKS in this case, Huxley. We've still got Dupree. Mate, you know what? Let's swap out Jax. Let's swap out Masuta. Let's bring him out. Let's bring You reinvest. You say, I invested big time in this project. I'm going to put more in. The fact that that's what Cloud9 pulling the plug killed me on. It's like, why did we do all this if you were never going to give me another good player? Like Zeppa should always been a stopgap. Maybe I should have even had a better player anyway, and I took too many of the compromised players. Maybe I should have like waited a few months, or I should have been given like like this is a trial period, figure out your other player, then we start the clock. So in those cases, I do think what we've learned from teams like that, and the G2 and the Vitalities of the world, is I do think it's way harder to just put together a new squad. It's why, if you notice, a lot of these international, like, tier 2 teams, but with formerly big names, the Apexes of the world, the Gorillas of the world, Titans, these teams on paper look weird. Like, they should be way better than they are. And then you see them in the server, like, oh, what's going on? Well, there is no core there. There's not, what their success is based on is you thinking of how most of them played in maybe 5 different teams. So you never really knew what they'd be like together. I do think if you got a core of a team, now you can give them a bit longer, assuming that core was good, because now what you're looking for is chemistry or fill in some of the blanks. If you're making a totally fresh team, I think you can pull the plug if after 3 or 4 months it's not working. Like, at that point in time, what you even, like, whatever hope you were using is gone. Like, you were basing it off like a dream of what that lineup might be like. So I think it's more like I would give like, I know now it's not a great example, but the MIBR cores and the Fnatic cores of the world, and the Astralis cores, a little bit extra time to keep cycling the other players. If I've made a fresh team, especially like an international team, I probably would be a bit more ruthless with that personally.
Fair enough. I think the example that it's a bit unorthodox to suggest is OG. Like, I actually kind of like how they've approached the whole, like, build a team from scratch, because I think they've given every iteration of their lineup enough time before pulling the plug. Like, I think about the first inception of the roster, and they're like, oh, well, you've got 3 IGLs on the team. You've got Alexi B, Valde, and NBK. How is this going to work? Well, yeah, to be fair, it looked pretty shit out the gates. I think the first tournament was like CS Summit or something like that, and they just looked absolutely abysmal. They had 0 map pool. Even on the maps they were picking, they just looked clueless. You could tell that there are too many voices, too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. And then eventually they realized, okay, well, hey, we've got a disagreements with NBK here. We've pushed the lineup as much as we can. Or I think actually the first move was Issa, right? They moved Issa out first, and so they're like, okay, well, maybe it's just a firepower thing. And so they move out Issa, and then they try to chop and change again. And they give all of these lineups enough time to at least develop. And although they aren't like peaking at any of these tournaments and they're not like winning championships, they're still going deep enough. And I still think like they're always a relevant org. Like, they're never like out of the conversation. And I think that some of these orgs that have just been completely just out, like, clueless. I mean, the later iterations of C9 just completely like botched it. I mean, you weren't really talking about them at all eventually after Woxic left. But I think that conversation was always there for OG, where they were at least able to fight for playoffs, and then they had the odd playoff runs here and there. And obviously some of them were online, but I think that they still had competitive nature to them. So I like the approach that OG has had with it. I think that overall, I think I want to give at least 1 major cycle to building a team from scratch, because again, who knows? But I think once if you got that core, I think you've got to keep that core around for at least like 3. Because at that point, it's like you can just exchange things around for a long time. When they re-signed, what was it? It was Alexi B, it was Valde, and it was Mantu that they re-signed for like a long period of time. And that core could have stayed along for quite a long time. I thought that could have worked, but I think obviously Mantu had other issues with the injury and then when coming back and whatnot. But and how they wanted to like play him within their system. But I think that idea of like keeping a core together and then shifting pieces in and out and trying different systems. I mean, they tried to get a more supportive rifler and then a more aggressive opper, but now they've gone more into the angle of like, okay, let's slim down on terms of the age. Let's get rid of Valde. Let's bring in Fiku and Neofrag and Dexter, and then see how we try to take a different perspective to the game with more Nexa IGLing younger players. And I just like that they're willing to run each idea through its course before actually trying out a new system in the future.
Okay. So, one of my topics I have here, which the whole reason you'll hear by the way I phrased the question, I did have a specific thought in mind, but I also didn't want to make it seem too obvious because exactly of the timing. So since everyone recently, thanks to the RMR result and the EPL win, is obviously loving Dupree because he's the only person to go to all 18 majors and all that jazz, right? Even though, like, that isn't really as fire as an accomplishment as it was years and years ago. And also, I will just add, that was never what you people used to say. The old thing people cared about was making top 8 dominated the majors. Magically, that just keeps like, you notice the achievement keeps getting less and less and less good until at the end it's like, you were alive and you entered the building 18 times. Like, look, yeah, he is the only one who did, but like, fucking hell. We've taken like the sexiness so far out of that accomplishment.
Yeah.
But since that's the big topic, and as a result, it brought up the whole discussion of like, is he an underrated player? Like, obviously, maybe he hasn't had the same plaudits as Device had, or obviously any of the players that have won more championships in anything approaching a star type role. Like, even the electronics of the world get a lot more credit than he does. You think of almost every team, they mostly, the first and second star, all get the plaudits, and they get, if anything, they almost never get missed out. It's usually the support element that gets no credit, or the IGL. So what I thought was, if we're going to say, most people seem to agree that he's the second star or like another star type player, that's probably the most underrated in history, because you do look at the resume and you look at the ups and downs and you look at the longevity and the individual skill and all this jazz. Who would be, aside from him, your most underrated second star in history? Who are you taking?
Oh, this is great. I mean, you have so many different great all-time lineups, and I think a lot of these lineups have a very underappreciated second star. But for me, I think I'm just gonna go with Fur on the SK core. I don't think he's gotten enough shine. I think that there was obviously like a huge conversation about, okay, well, he is that like super aggressive rifler and whatnot in tandem with coldzera, but I don't think he really got enough MVPs or like actual like hard awards to really back that up. I don't think he'll be remembered in that same way, and I'm glad that people are coming around to him, at least with the whole Imperial angle, that at least Fur has done something before, and you can see the ratings and the kind of impact that he has on the server now. But back then, I don't think he was nearly touted as much as coldzera, because you had coldzera, and obviously you had Fallen, and they were the more flashier players. They were the ones set up by Taco and whatnot. But Fur was the one that was really getting nitty gritty, and he was the one that was giving all this information over to coldzera and making sure that he was the Terminator for good reason, because he had all that information to really know where all these players are and target them individually. And I think that's why this nickname sticks so well. But Fur, I mean, I always talk about Overpass and him just pushing down into back fountains. He's MP9 into T-spawn in like 30 seconds. In some ways, he was the art before art actually existed, and he was doing it with the rifle, and he was still getting crazy numbers. Like, I don't know how the numbers that he were getting was just feasibly possible with the kind of playstyle that he was bringing to the table. So I think Fur overall for me is probably my most underrated second star. I've given honorable mention to Crims on Fnatic, because he's always had players around him. I think he's one of the most I think you've mentioned this before. He's one of the most underrated players, just period, in Counter-Strike, because no matter how many iterations he's had, he's always been consistently fragging on these teams. He'll play any role that you throw at him, and no matter what kind of iteration Fnatic has been thrown at him, be it international, be it Swedish, he's still put out the numbers. I mean, you could talk about the mentality all you want, but this guy's always been hungry to win on the server. He's always done what it takes. He's broken so many records even at the tail end of his career with like breaking kills on like regulation frags and whatnot. But I think this guy is just criminally underrated, having to play with the Olaf Meisters, the Flushes, the JWs, and whatnot, and never getting his true flowers either.
Yeah, those are actually the two names I had, and I actually went in a similar order. Like, on the Crims angle, like, I think if you just, again, longevity is insane on this player, and then you just look at his style, like, he's a super consistent player who's really, really good, but he's at his best when he is the second star. Like, if he has Olaf Meister in his prime, if he has even Brolan when he was entering something approaching, like, a peak period of his career, that's when, if you have, like, the one player who's, like, the super fragger, and then you have Crims, you are going to be in loads of finals. You are going to win a championship or two. You're going to be one of the better teams in the game. So, yeah, he was one I was considering, but I actually also plumped for Fur. And specifically to the year for me is the 2017 year. It's the one where they didn't win the majors, but they had like the 5 out of 6 run. And obviously at that Krakow major, they could have gone further. If people don't remember, the other major was the one where in the semis, even though they had like the stand-in, they had Fox in that tournament because it was when they'd kicked FNX. And they were basically always relevant, but just because it wasn't as good a year for like majors as 2016, it gets forgotten. And people don't even bring up that summer run. What's funny is because they get the bolts line up later when they were beating FaZe, everyone loves to big that one up. That one's way more ropey. That one's way more up and down. As you saw, that team fell off. And they fell off actually before, when they had the whole period where it was for him and Phelps who were having their issues. And then afterwards, obviously, they never recovered when they became Ahmad never were really a great team again. But the reason why I specifically bring that year up is because for me, here's the difference. When you look at 2016, coldzera's unreal. Probably is the best player overall. He's the player where on that team, he can do more than anyone else can do on their team with their pieces. pieces. He was unreal, and Fallen was really good that year, both IGLing and also like fragging out in big games, getting the big clutches. But the one for me is this. In 2017, this is where not changing players makes people keep the same narrative. I think one of the reasons I think Fallen is overrated is, in my opinion, if you had someone in 2016 who was like 5% worse than Coldzera, you lose tons. You won't win almost nothing. You might never have won a major. And in 2017, Fur was the second best player on that team, not Fallen. But the thing is, cause Fallen, just like you see now, the one thing that's never betrayed him is being good in clutch scenarios. It's basically the whole thing he does on Imperial now. He doesn't even really dominate against anyone good. What he gets is like a young team or an up-and-coming team, and then it's a close game, and they're playing a bit safe, and he does some ballsy move in a 1v2, or he goes to a smoke, or he takes a crazy like shot, like a flick shot they started off that psychs them out, and then he wins basically off experience, like using pressure, like a poker player. He's bluffing. He doesn't really have anything, but he just puts that pressure on you that makes you shit your pants. The problem is, he was still able to do that in 2017. He was still a pretty good IGL, but as a player, I thought his level went down a bit more, and for me, he never was a true superstar player. I know it's a controversial opinion, but I will say, all the people who tell me I'm wrong aren't ever going back and watching games or demos. They're all just remembering things. If you know how memories work, if you don't revisit them, it gets more and more and more glistening. It gets better and better and better. It's like the fish story. It gets more and more and more. Suddenly he won every 1v1. Suddenly he dominated every fucking train CT side. Suddenly he always beat Astralis and he didn't. Here's the difference. When you go and look in 2017, yeah, first of all, like you said, that was one of the years where Fur might have been robbed of the most MVPs ever, because the way the team was set up, it's a bit like Device in Astralis. If you win, Device is going to be the MVP, and if SK wins, Coldzera is going to be the MVP, because the way the team's structured is like, it's like Shaq. If I'm throwing like alley-oops all the time, it doesn't matter how good my pass is, if he's slamming them, he's getting the points, he's the MVP. That's the way the team structure works. So the problem I had was this. I actually think even though Coldzera was epic that year, and certainly like I could have seen a world where, if I'm going to say randomly there was 7 MVPs to give out, there's a world where you could have given like 4 to Coldzera and 3 to... If you don't know, I think you only won 1. You won that like ECS one, and that was one where if you go and look, like you almost had to be like 1.5 times better than everyone to do it. It's like, well, if you could only win doing that, then bloody hell, and even then it's a close set of matches, like you're just never going to do it. So I think that's a year where the people who look on the Wikipedias, it won't show you how good this guy was. It's not going to make him seem that brilliant. But I thought, like again, like you're saying, what he could do on CT side, like those overpass wins that they used to basically always get against the Kerrigan teams. If they don't win that map, which by the way was a good map also for Kerrigan teams, they don't win some of these series. Maybe FaZe would have been better. I always thought it was actually a bit unfair because people talked like, it's Kerrigan has a losing record against Fallen. It's like, bro, it's the guy who's pushing CT side, like you say, every fucking time, getting kills, putting pressure, putting the fear of God in you, doing it with an MP9. There's even that mad story he tells, which sounds stupid as fuck, but this is why it'd be so intimidating, that he didn't want people to give him anti-strat information. He doesn't want to know where they are. That's even worse, because at least if he kills you and you think, right, it's like Device, he's some nerd in a demo and he knew I'd be there. If you think, oh, actually, he just runs around the corner, he doesn't give a fuck and just wrecks me, that's really hard to play against. That's going to psych you out. It's like that famous quote, that fucking Marshawn Lynch quote, where he's like, if you just run through a motherfucker's face again and again and again and again and again, then you don't have to worry about him anymore. It's like, well, yeah, you fucking lunatic. Like, who the hell's going to who wants to put up with that? Like, that sounds terrifying, doesn't it? It's like some Mike Tyson shit. Like, yeah, I don't want to play against you, unsurprisingly. So I think stylistically, especially that year, he like activated the whole team. And again, he was part of the reason they were a super dangerous team that could have accomplished way more than they did. And his skill level is just fucking bonkers, mate. This is another guy where, when you talk about the all-time great entries, they're going to go like Dupree. They're going to go Apex, if they remember. They're going to say maybe, if they go back in time, Freiburg. They're going to maybe pick out, maybe Config will get a throw in there. You know, you keep going through the names. This is the guy that probably gets left off the list, but he might be the best. He's up there. Like, again, he was doing it in some scenarios where, like, that isn't a tactic Fallen's calling. Like, Fallen and them are doing the shit where they're in the 2v2s and they're in the late round scenarios and he's in 1v1. First, just, like, giving you, like, insane advantages. He's opening rounds. He's running through. He doesn't care if the people are there and they're going to frag him. That mindset and the skill set he had was bonkers. So, yeah, I really do think he's the one who tortured FaZe Clan. I think he's the one that made them super, super dangerous that year. And that's why also, in my opinion, an underrated part about the demise of that core was it isn't that Fur was a bad player. If you look at his career, I think he is just someone who got very much sated after the grind years by the money, by the fame, by being a top player. It's one of the reasons why behind the scenes I've heard some sort of like he's been a bit of an arsehole to the orgs and sort of been, and I basically, it was implied to me, he's the guy who sort of mailed in 3 months or 6 months here and there, or didn't try as hard. So I don't think he ever lost the skills. I think he's one of those mercurial talents where when they don't care, they're not motivated, they don't play that much, or they just play the game, whatever, and just mail it in. But you see, when he does that, the team just dies, mate. That's when you're dead. That's when the team goes right off a cliff. Suddenly you're not any good on maps like Inferno because he's dying at B. Suddenly you don't win an overpass game that you're not supposed to. Suddenly you don't have someone. Cold Zero stayed good on for much longer than Fur did in terms of that initial period. But it didn't matter. You weren't winning games. So in my opinion, I think he's a mad underrated like X Factor. And as you say, in Imperial, there's the difference. If Fallen just does all that bullshit, Fur just still frags everyone's head off, mate. He still just turns up and goes, I'll just be the best player in the server. Maybe because now, I mean, there's these weird angles you've seen in interviews. This is like one of the few angles left, like emotionally, that can motivate the guy. He's not going to win championships anymore, but now this weird fucked up angle of like, you know, it's that whole like us against the world. Like, they say we can't do it and they're all hating on us. Like, bro, like half the fucking world wants you to do this. Half the world would like actively DDoS the other guys to make you win the game. But okay, we know the victim mentality that's coming from that particular background. And then the other angle is like that whole shit of like, or the movie angle of like I used to be poor and then I'd go to like Sao Paulo with no money, bro, and like now I'm going to like the chat. Like maybe that's why he's brought it back out of him. So he could have had a better career. He could have been a different player. But mate, it's like I said on Twitter, if you were wanting to, if I had to actually pay to attend an event to see these players, I couldn't watch them online. That's one of the few players when he's on his game I would pay the entrance fee to see. Like just incredibly entertaining.
Yeah, utility didn't matter for this guy. I think that was the craziest part. Like he would push smokes, like he would take fights dry, like he wouldn't ask for any flashes. He'd just win the fights outright. I think it pioneered so many different styles of play nowadays, like, and it inspired so many more to come to play that more ballsy style. I mean, obviously, I think Yekindar has learned a lot from that. He also, I mean, on Liquid, I don't think he has many flashes behind him. I don't think he has much setup as well. I think he's kind of the living embodiment or the motivation from Fur to how he plays. Obviously, there's a bit of differences in kind of their like mentalities of the game and whatnot. But I also the other angle, I do agree with the whole skill dropping off isn't necessarily the case. It's more so that motivation, because after he left MIBR, I think he was a journeyman for a little while. He went to like the Imperial before they actually rebanded to the Last Dance. He played on so many like tier 2 Brazilian organizations, and he was bottom of the barrel. Like he was getting some absolutely abysmal ratings. I think he played with FNX a couple of times, and he was getting lower ratings than FNX. Like this shit doesn't happen often. And I think that as soon as he came onto Imperial, even then, it still felt like he was kind of wishy-washy. And then once they brought in Cello, there's something that's been reignited in this guy, that Cello was brought to his emotion. And I think that you can see the way he's way more passionate in the server, and you can see he's much more energized. And that's directly correlated with how he's performing it throughout the RMRs, especially ever since Cello was brought on, that he's just so much more motivated to get kills and to roll back the years and play how he used to, with that unbridled aggression. He didn't really care about what the end result was. He would still try to figure out what would just bring my team the best advantage.
So then for your third question, your question just says, are we heading to a star rifling dominance meta once more? So set it up.
So I think I wanted to bring this question forward mostly because I wanted to see your historical angle on it, because I can think of teams and players here and there, but I don't necessarily have a holistic picture on kind of the macro level of the rifling meta. But right now, I'm kind of trying to theory craft, at least looking at the rankings and which teams are star level teams because of their Opper, or if it's for their rifler. And I've been just taking a look at the top 10 as of right now. And I look at FaZe with Twists and Rops. I think that Brokey isn't necessarily a superstar Opper. I think it comes down to more so the riflers of Twists and Rops. And then you go to Na'Vi. I think obviously you have Simple on your team. I think that's an exception to the rule. But you've also got Electronic and Bit. I think Bit in particular making them that kind of supernova team. I think you've got, and Vitality, you've now got Spinks on the lineup, who is completely elevated this. Magisk as well. On Liquid, you've got Yekindar and you've got Elige. You can obviously add in Naf. On Cloud9, and I think that's obviously bigger than OC, and the key impact reason why they're winning, not necessarily OC himself. On Cloud9, you've got Axile, of course. On G2, you've got Nico, of course. And then Queserado and Yuri on Furia, less so than Safe. I don't think Safe has had nearly as much impact. Even on lesser teams like an Astralis, you got Blame F and formerly Config, rather than Farley getting them wins. On Mouse, you've now got Frozen doing a lot of the legwork, less so than Torzi. On Heroic, you've got, I mean, obviously we've talked about previously, CadiaN isn't necessarily a star AWP player. You've got to have it carried by players like Stan and Tessus, or maybe even a Yabi. And then I think you get the point. Basically, I've run down the top 10, and all of these teams have key impact fraggers, and more so in the rifling positions rather than the AWP. So I think I'm trying to wonder whether or not we're actually heading to a position where we should be valuing these star riflers more so than those star AWP players.
Okay, I see what you mean. I mean, it's one of the reasons, by the way, why, if you ever saw when I like reposted on, because someone just linked me it from years and years ago, in like 2017 when I did some of those snipe, like it was almost like the watch parties I do now, but I was actually going to a Stockholm, Sweden studio, and I would have like guests come in. So I did one where it was like me, Get Right, Semler, and that might even have been Lerp or something. No, it was Natu, I think. One of those. And then there was one I did where it was Pimp, Semler, and Lerpis. And then in one of the questions during the break between maps, the question was, like, what would you change about the AWP? And I'm the one who has the edgiest take of all time, which is I would just revert every nerf, and I think it needs to be stronger. And obviously they all lose their shit, because what they do is, I mean, basically this video is just an exercise in someone who knows what logical fallacies are, and then a bunch of really smart Counter-Strike people who don't. And so even when they're making a good point, they just fuck it up with a logical fallacy. Like they say something like, well, you know, the best players all use the AWP. And I would say, like, well, Pimp, you use the AWP and you're fucking garbage. So, like, you know, it's like there was a million angles that didn't work on. Like, what they really mean by that is, like, look how simple you use it. Not like the best players use it, therefore the gun is good. Like, it was all fallacious logic. Well, the point I would make is, when I made that point at the time, it was controversial. The reason I posted it now is, if you think about what people have said for the last 2 or 3 years, primarily because of Zebu and fucking Simple, people would say it's even more controversial, because, like, what are you talking about? They're the absolute best players. But the problem is, I actually think that plays to my point, because Simple in no universe uses the AWP like an AWPer. He does use it like a mobile shotgun. And Zewu is probably, like, would still be world class on a rifle, and even then as an AWPer, it's not like he forces it in the same way. And then you look at the other AWPers, it's like, actually I think now we've settled into a point where you see why I say the AWP's like, it's very good in a very limited way. It's not the god weapon, though. It's not the best all-round. The best weapon is a rifle. The best weapon in the game, in Counter-Strike, probably in the history of the game, is an AK. The price is insane. The damage is insane. And if you are the best player and you can hit the first bullet, it is just the best weapon, aside from an AWP in a very specific scenario where they can't hit you, you hit them and you get the free kill. Like, it's actually, it's a way more situational weapon, the AWP. So I think now, actually, you will see, yes, I think this is the time period where you're seeing that actually it's the other way around. You have to be an amazing AWPer to make it OP. I actually think there's a lot of AWPers where they're just good, or some of them are even the bloody IGLs like CadiaN and Jame, and they're like sort of good, or they're sometimes good, and maybe they put you over the top, but they're not like Zebu and Simple, where every game you rely on them, every CT off, you have to get away from their sight. It's not really like that. So I do think actually we've moved into a period where, in general, it's about the riflers. It's why in some of the teams, the Enters of the world show this as well. It's just about having 2 really good riflers and then like a decent pack where the rest makes sense tactically. You can get by hiding an AWPer a little bit. Liquid does it sometimes. I think, yeah, unless they're the god player anyway, they're just the most skilled player on the server. You would rather have Nico than CadiaN. You would rather have like one of these players, Axile, than fucking, who would take Jame? I mean, ignore the IGL angle here. It's just like a player that's going to be the best player on your team. So I think actually at the moment, one of the reasons I would speculate why it is more of like a rifle era is because it's such a CT-sided game right now. Pretty much every map is CT-sided, right? The weird, counterintuitive phenomenon that happens in that case, I'll give a historical example for. So the other time period in history where everyone cried about the CT side was the last stanza of 2014, the last sort of 4 to 5 months, because that was when you had all those teams come up that used to just get 12 CT rounds on Inferno. You had Fnatic, you had TSM, you had fucking Envious even could put up a mass, and they were a T-sided team. You had like, these teams could all just put up monster CT sides. Now it was causing factors like utility was starting to get a bit OP on CT side. People knew all the smokes on Inferno and these sorts of maps. It got so that people had like the right rotations, and then you went to Gamble Stack. People knew, this might sound bizarre, but sometimes CT side can be the best side to OP pistol force by, because you can just hide around the corner, and to come in the sight, the guy has to sort of come close range. On T side, like try doing like a Tech 9 rush of like long on fucking overpass. Good luck on T side.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to fucking get close to the guy. You can just back off and use space. So basically, in that era, the thing I noticed that's counterintuitive is because you've made the T side harder and harder and harder, and people will know that stat that if you go look at this year's ratings, and because in the modern day we can do CT and T side, the only players with a positive plus minus differential are Simple and Zebu. So you may as well take them out of the equation. They're outliers. That means even people like Twists, who your eyes tell you are the best T players, have essentially minus stats. They're doing worse on T side overall than they are than overall in the game, right? So what I would say is this: when you make it harder to play T side, you make it harder to rifle, the ones who are the absolute best will rise like cream to the absolute top. It's why in this era I'm talking about, when it was the monster CT sides, you go look, that's where all the great entries made their name. That's where Apex and LDLC and then later Titan became a monster. That's when Dupree, on a team that sometimes used to not even win that many T sides when he had Fetish, became a legend. He was considered one of the best in the world on a team that wins like 3 T rounds. That's because he was the whole reason you could win a T round. Bialy on Virtus Pro was a beast. Then the envious teams also with Shocks. Actually, Shocks being very good was another fact. They made him an entry, believe it or not. It was the one period where Happy sort of was able to control this guy. He didn't have to be let off the leash. So in my opinion, you're seeing a similar thing now. That's why if Gambit wins a game, Cloud9, it's going to be an Axal Guoth. It's not just going to be like, Shiro can have a great game and they can lose. It's going to be Axel is going to be the difference maker because he's going to break the meta. He's going to break the matrix. So if people don't know, that was the whole factor as well as to why the Happy teams were revered, because they came into the CT side meta, but then they could win T-halves and they could break the game. And famously, he said that line, like, I broke the meta. That seemed arrogant years later. He was right at the time he did. He actually found a style that could counter this. Like, he had absurd skill on his team, but it was a style that worked. So I actually think that's the reason why some of these teams are so effective now. And that's why it's actually a very interesting game right now. I don't think you can construct teams the same way you would have 2 years ago and build around the same players.
I think a very interesting angle is that also a lot of these players are just much more intelligent. Like the level of the game in terms of like strats have also gone up. So you can't necessarily do the same things that you did in previous years where you could just post up on an AWP and just play like a turret and then completely fire down on these opponents. There is much more nuance to everything now with these executes, with just defaults and just cordoning off an AWP onto a certain part of the map and avoiding these players and making them like kind of work for it. And with that being said, I mean, even if they are in situations where they are posted up, I mean, now these riflers are so aware that you can see like the really fantastic ones are the ones that pre-fire the AWPs out of the server, and then they just one bang you through just a pre-fire down. I mean, you could think like if you're playing like Library on Inferno and then you just hop out apartments and you kill the guy small pit and you kill the guy Library, like that can't be done with an AWP. That has to be done with the rifle, and that's how you kind of crack open the A bomb site. But I think that nowadays it's like you have to be a great rifler as opposed to just being a great AWP player. Like even these AWP players have to be good on the rifle, because at this point the economy is in such a kind of volatile way now where your money can get snapped still pretty comfortably, and you've got to be really good on that rifle. I mean, even Searson on Big has been having some serious issues because he can't play on the rifle. And you can see even with the AWP players like the Simples, the Zywus, as you said, they look completely phenomenal on the rifles, and for very good reason, because the AWP has kind of been nullified in some ways just by the sheer versatility that this weapon can bring. You can now speed up the game as you please without having to worry about the AWP, because you can cordon off them so well with utility and how effective it is now. And more so just the sheer skill of people with that, they can pivot wherever they want. As soon as you take the AWP off the table, the world's your oyster. You can go anywhere you want. So I think that the level of intelligence and the level of depth in the playbook of these teams have also allowed this rifling dominance to come out more so than the AWP.
All right, let's do the last topic then. So this one, again, I've put this one really wide open. Like, anyway, you can go any angle you want on this, but I thought it would be a fun one, right? Obviously, this is a loaded question, and I will explain that. I've said which old map would help fix the pool the most right now. So obviously, I am implying, like you agree, that the pool's a bit fucked, it needs to be fixed. And also, this map, whatever it brings, is going to be like the cure to whatever the ails us. So what do you think on this, and what would your suggestion be?
It is fucked. It is fucked right now. I won't lie. But if we have to look at the pool right now, let's just take a look at some of these maps: Mirage, Dust 2, Vertigo, and Ancient. These maps are so tactically inefficient right now. They are so mind-numbing as an analyst to sit and watch, because it is the same strategies nearly deployed every single time. I'd say Mirage is probably the rare exception. But on Dust 2, it's smoke suicide as a CT, go down lower, get lower control. If you have lower control, you win the round. If the T's can counter you, you've gotten the whole space of the map. You do a mid to B split, whatnot. On Ancient, you take mid. You basically just that's the only real part of the map that has any versatility. If not, you wait the B utility as a T, and then you reaggress off of the utility, or you just instant A execute, whatnot. I can go on and on about all these 4 maps, but I think the map that would completely fix any of this, you could pull out any of those 4 maps and you could put in Train. I think Train should have never been removed from the map pool, because I think it's the mark of a truly tactically brilliant team. That map is so complicated that and the nuance of how important some of these rotations have to be and how on point they have to be makes it so that if you are a good team on this, you can be lauded as one of the greatest teams in your potential era. I mean, you think about the teams that have been touted as some of the greatest teams. You think about Astralis on Train. They made their name by overthrowing VP in Atlanta. You think about VP, they battled back against SK. You had SK making their name themselves. So I think that tactical style that you and that identity that you can bring shines through on a map like Train. I think that the good T sides on that map makes any of the other maps, I think maybe bar Inferno or bar maybe. Yeah, I think even just Inferno in general, or maybe even Nuke rather. You can really show why you're such a tactically brilliant team on that specific map. I think beyond those 2 maps, there isn't anything in the pool that could suggest that. We've also had some incredible games on that map in particular. I did a little bit of research of some of the greatest games. Astralis versus NRG at the Star Ladder Major. And they actually played twice on Train. One was in this crazy double, triple overtime with Cirque playing absolutely insane. And then you obviously have the one they played in, was it the semifinal, I believe, with Device's crazy 3K that should have gotten a graffiti on the bottom of the B site. And then you also have obviously iconic grand finals on that map as well. Astralis versus VP at Atlanta with the crazy inner rush by Glaive. You obviously have SK versus VP at the tail end of these teams' career. They were still brawling on Train at Epicenter. I mean, I think there's so many, even Fnatic versus FaZe, a crazy upset for FaZe, against FaZe from Fnatic, a team that were the underdogs in that situation. You had Flusha rolling it back the years on the T side. All of those matches, I think, were just so magical, and I think that it never got its credit. I mean, even if you take a look at the micro aspects of it, there are all of these maps in the pool right now where the sites are so difficult to retake. You can't necessarily have a way back in for the CTs, but the B bomb side was always doable. There was always a way to get back into it, no matter the man disadvantage. You could always have room to get back in. There were less angles to handle. Unlike, I mean, obviously the A side is a bit different, but I think there's a bit of skill that's involved in that. There's even tactics in that retake as well, making sure that you can have this little chess game of, am I going to sandwich? Am I going to smoke the E-box cross when I come into sight? Am I going to go old bomb? Am I going to come connected? There's so many different angles that you can come through with and different approaches that you can come to when the bomb is planted A, that those brilliant retakes that come through from 2v4s and 2v3s are that much more insane. And then also you also have those crazy B bomb side retakes. So even at a micro level, I like this. And then finally, I think it's the mark of a great opper. I think that it is an opera's paradise, so to speak, but there's so many long lines that you have to be a master of the single scope. You have to understand the kind of nuance of how to use the AWP. You can't double scope from camera down to TCon because you could get exposed from pop dog. You've got to make sure that you understand that you can play one scope and you can flick on over to both angles. And as a T-opper, you got to make sure that you know your long lines yourself. Maybe brown halls when you jump down and you take the fight all the way down to Z, or you fight from pop dog to Ivy, or you again. I mean, if you're on a retake, maybe you're looking from camera all the way down to T-con. So all of these different angles, I think it makes CT operas that are really good, really great, and it's these T operas that can break the game, so to speak, and fly through that angle, and outsmart the opposing AWP. It makes them look that much better. So I have a lot of reasons here because I personally, Train was my favorite map in the pool, and I think that Valve kind of looked at it in such a way and said, oh, well, the casuals don't understand it, and they don't really understand how to throw the utility. It's a bit too complicated, and there's no point. Nobody wants to play it. They think that it's not casual enough, so there's no point of it in a pool. But I think it brought so much nuance to the map pool, and it made the mark of a truly great team truly great.
Yeah, I actually also had Train as my pick for this one because the weird thing about it is everyone always either just says the boring Tuscan. Like, I don't know why people keep saying that. Like, it's so many years since CS 1.6 is a different map, and also the version they finished now isn't even the map you're all asking for 10 years. I don't know why that's like the go-to. It's almost like a meme answer. And then the other one is people just want to cycle, like maybe Cash comes back or some shit like, or they suggest some like other map that's in like the active duty thing but isn't a competitive map. Like, I don't know fucking at this point in time what they say, but they obviously used to have a few used to suggest. Yeah, there you go. Like, the one for me, the reason why it's obviously Train is because what I'm also trying to fix is, yeah, first of all, there's a bunch of maps that just kind of are a bit crap. Like, unless you're the absolute best team in the world on that map at any point in time, dude, even like the number 3, number 4 teams on these maps sometimes avoid them and both like float it in the second veto and just go to like, you know, Inferno or whatever as they decide, like, well, whatever, handshake on that, or they even are willing to take Dust 2 over maps like Ancient and Vertigo. And also, I'll throw this in there, like you said, the key thing for me is this is why you can't look at like win rates on maps overall, because the difference qualitatively between how the best team on that map plays and everyone plays can be enormous. And on these maps, I think it's insane. Like, for me, Train was a map where, if you remember the absolute best teams, they could make the map look T-sided because they were so fucking good, and what they did worked, that they could destroy defenses. Meanwhile, if I play that map normally, or I'm watching lesser teams, that's a CT-sided map for me. You spawn a map control, you sit there, they have to use all their utility just to get even basic entries. They have to sort of like do big rotations on T-side. Like, it's actually really way more tricky than people seem to realise, and that's why, as you say, look how many classic matches it spawned, how many great series it's a part of. It's basically up there with Inferno. It's just one of the best maps to ever be in Counter-Strike. It's actually just a fucking banger. It's actually the area, I will say also, when people hate on Mirage, does produce a lot of fucking great games, so doesn't it? Yeah. There's a lot of great fucking matches where that was like a swing map that won someone a championship or got them over the line or didn't win you one. And then I'll also say as well, when you're on this particular map, I think this is another example of where people will look at factors like how you play on the CT side, and cause against with bad teams, it looks easy. You don't realise, like, what I love about that map is, if you're bad on T side, it's a nightmare trying to get into the sites and get the bombs down. You can just get eaten up by people just holding their spot. But as you say, even when you plant, there's a million angles they can come in from. There's a billion spots they can hide, or be behind a train, or have a line of sight, or get an off angle on the, or as in on the retake when the CTs come. They're like, it's just a hard map to play at all times on T side. Like, I don't think it's ever easy. If it's easy, you're probably just playing a really bad team who doesn't know how the map works. So I think it's just a great example of, I think in the map pool right now, the economy's too CT sided. As much as there's problems with like the CT pistol, it doesn't seem to matter that much. All these games go super long. I think this would just make the tournament scene way more interesting. And the second, whatever map you take out Vertigo, all I'll say about this is, where's all the classic games on those maps? Like, there might have been some exciting games. Where are the classics? Where are the ones that in like 10 years, oh, remember that? Dude, in the final when Na'Vi played G2, everyone remembers the nuke game. No one fucking remembers the ancient game. But some people probably know, oh yeah, that was map 1, ancient 1. You don't remember it. You think of Vertigo. The only Vertigo game anyone even knows is that Astralis won against Team Liquid. And that's just because of the context of the pick. They don't even remember the way the game went. They think it was like 16-0 or something. Like, it's mental. No one fucking remembers these games. Even, like I said, the teams that become the best on these maps, you'll notice the only time people pick these maps isn't when they're the best and they've got a good map pool. It's when they're the best and they have a shit map pool. It's when your whole thing was like Nip or Astralis. You know you're a sort of whack team. So you go, you know what, let's just go fucking ham on Ancient. Let's make that our thing. We're going to pick it to everyone who doesn't ban it, basically. You're not doing that because it's an awesome map. You're doing it because it's like your last chance. You're just trying to like throw a grenade in there and just be fucking crazy. And you risk that you're going to die as well. So I think you can see by the way the games play out, by the types of matches they produce, by where the teams themselves are ever willing to pick this shit and go into it, you can sort of see what the good maps are. And there's a reason why, as much as people hate on Mirage, there'll always be teams that first pick it. As much as people hate on fucking even Dust 2, there's teams that are going to specialise on Dust 2 and be good on Dust 2 and pick it against other good teams. So I think a lot of the sort of factors that we grade maps on in terms of what we want competitively, not for casuals, I think Train's near the top of the list. And I think it's only the fact of like Australis didn't like it for a while. Or I don't know. There's some weird elements on, like you said, casuals hated it. It wasn't played much in active duty. Took the least picked in tournaments. These are all the factors people use to kick the map out. But I also think that's part of the reason also why it was a map not played as often at the end, because the really good teams, like, no one's willing to play it against them. And if some teams were the VPs, then if like 4 of the top teams all have Trinity, that might be your permaban if you're the 9th best team. You might start like that and go, because you say it's really complicated. Fuck learning that map. It's why if you notice in the modern day, the only people who automatically say Overpass is the worst map are people who can never play it. None of their teams play it. They don't want to learn it. So what they're really saying is, I don't want to have to do French. Why do I have to speak French? I'm never going to France. It's that sort of argument from school. You know, it's not really that the map's bad.
Also, the identities of just the pool right now is just so like clustered. It feels like there is no real nuance to the veto anymore. I just feel like, okay, well, yeah, well, maybe I don't get to play Mirage, but I'm a pretty decent Dust 2 team. And like, I've played that map before. It's very similar styles. I mean, Mirage, Dust 2, Vertigo, Ancient, any of those maps, I feel like stylistically, if you're a good team, you'll be handled on any of those maps. But I think you could absolutely throw a curveball in the veto. You would get so much more on the desk, so the desk would be so much more interesting because you'd get into those vetoes. Maybe you see, okay, is there going to be a curveball of a train here? Does the Overdog actually flex their map pool, or do they actually shirk away and they go for comfort? I think those different angles are super interesting. I actually want to ask you, what map would you take out of the pool right now? Which one seems like the most flagrant one to you to allow train into the pool?
The problem is, it depends what day I wake up. Like, it is between Vertigo and fucking Ancient. Like, as much as people complain about Dust 2, it's like, I've got bigger fish to fry before I can get to fucking Dust 2. At least Dust 2 has some playmate. You have some retakes, etc. The biggest problems I have is, like, I do think Vertigo's just still really boring for so much of the team round. Until the fights happen, it's just boring as shit. And then Ancient, I just think nobody can actually ever truly fucking play CT perfectly. I think it's just impossible on that map. And I don't think that in a good way. Like, wow, it's really hard. No, it's impossible. You can't do it. It's like, there's so much luck involved with that. There's so many fights like that. All those fights where they're going throughout the cave area, it's like people are we're just going on luck, spraying through a smoke. And if the guy's there and I get the kill with 5v4, we go on. And if he doesn't die, then I'm just wait another 30 seconds. Like, I think, again, it makes for bad fucking games. There's no classics on it. People only pick it when it's to be an arsehole, basically, and know that no one will actually play it. So I think I would probably have to put, as much as it's like a Sophie's choice, I would have to fucking probably take Ancient out. I just don't think it's ever actually deserved its spot. But I also do fucking despise Vertigo still.
Yeah, nobody's figured it out, right? There's no truly best team on it, and I think that's the main issue. Like, you had that period where Astralis was really good on it, but that was mostly just because Config would just rip heads off in mid. It wasn't necessarily anything tactically brilliant that you say, oh, this redefines the meta, and this is how you set up a star player to just break through mid. I mean, now at this point, it's very much so like, yeah, we just default Outlast utility, and then maybe you just get away in. I think if you had to make a case for any of the other maps, I don't even think you could. I mean, the two maps that I don't think we mentioned was Cache. I think Cache is, again, still too similar to the maps that are in the pool. They would essentially just rehash the same issues. And then Cobblestone is just a steaming hot pile of garbage right now, especially just with the rework. I think they've changed the A site and they've made it just completely open bomb site in the middle of nowhere, and they've completely removed danger, and I think they've just completely ruined that map. So I don't think that would work either. But yeah, that's my take on the map pool at the moment.
Right, that's it. There we go.
Yeah, sweet.
We'll wrap it there.